the shame between us. So, hello everyone. My name is Cheyenne Tyler Jacobs, and I am actually the newly appointed Vice President of the We Are Her. So I'm very excited to be able to be working with a community that's doing this work with survivors. One thing I really love about the organization, one of the reasons before I was, on the board, just, finding them through social media was how, as Stevie would say, we do the and work, so after a lot of times folks have maybe sought justice, whether that looks like going to initial counseling, therapy, going the legal route, whatever that looks like. Sometimes we don't have many services that, are able to kind of continue the conversation of, well, what's next in relationships? What's next with yourself? What's next with you being a part of a family component in a friend group, right? And that's one of the things I love about this organization, is that we have these events and we are able to create, plans, content, whatever may have you, that kind of answer those questions that I know I was looking for, right? So this conversation of the shame between us was actually presented over the summer at our retreat. And initially, this presentation was done for folks who are survivors, right? And knowing just, I was able to connect with Stevie before we had this presentation, that we have a lot of folks coming from many different backgrounds. As far as some folks I think are, could be therapists, they're also looking to give resources. Some people are looking for this workshop, right, for in themselves. So, I was preparing even this morning, really meditating on this conversation and seeing a lot. That's how I think a lot is the only word I can give to what's happening, not only in folks' personal lives, in the world. And I think that there is a need for this conversation of shame. So I'm going to try to, hit a lot of different avenues of shame for those who might be coming as a survivor themselves, looking at it for their own work, for those maybe just trying to get some tidbit conversations going in their own, practice. So just to give that, that kind of overlay. So once again, my name is Cheyenne Tyler Jacobs. So based in Atlanta, I am a filmmaker and I work in media. I have been able to work with Army survivors and Rape on Campus, Black Love Page. And again, I am the vice president of We Are Her, and I'm also a board member of Safe Bay. So residing in Atlanta, Georgia, and I work a lot with sexual violence prevention, racism and trauma. And I am a spoken word artist and, like I said, a filmmaker and writer. So a lot of that also looks like including that in my work. So most recently, that looks like doing a project, for example, with Safe Bay on consent, right? Because I think media is powerful. I think film is powerful. And if we can, do a lot of the work we're doing here and bring it out into the general public in many different forms, like, why not? Why wouldn't we do that, right? So our objectives is understanding the roots of shame, understanding the forms of shame, connecting the dots between how stereotype, implicit bias drives shame, and identify practices and management techniques to quiet the mind when shame rises. So really having a big understanding that we didn't just wake up, and had shame in ourselves. But a lot of times this is a very systematic form of not only oppression, this is generational trauma. There is many things at play when we're talking about shame. So I have an activity for us to do just to get started. So I want us to, and you can kind of see the example of the box here of our values. So here's a list of values, and these are just a snippet of list. There's more values that you can have, of course, but these are just a few examples I was able to pull from actually a very good friend of mine named Astrid Ferguson, who is a licensed life coach. And she also works within DEI. So we did this activity together, and I was like, I think this is a very good activity when we're talking about shame. So I want us to take a few minutes. Might call us back at maybe even a 1:17. And I want you to list your value. So I believe there's 5 boxes here. So listing down your value, right? So let's say your value is humor, right? If you're like me, I can't have people in my life that aren't funny because life is hard and we need to laugh, right? And I want you to rate how much you value that. So if you're like, it's really important for me to have humor in my life, it is so important for me to be able to find joy in comedy, find joy in laughing, I'm going to say like that's a 10, and we're doing a 1 to 10 scale. So if your value is humor, if your value is honesty, if your value is fun, tell me how much on a scale of 1 to 10 that you value that. So we're going to again come back at about 117, just so we can all get that down, and make sure you have that in front of you, because it is something that we're going to be utilizing throughout this conversation. And we have a couple seconds here, but for anyone who would like to share, I would love for us to throw in the chat what some of the values we selected were. I will actually throw some of mine in as well. Love that we have communication, personal growth, community, communication 10, clarity 9, adventure 10, love adventure. And I love that I see a pattern of communication happening as well. Honesty, altruism, safety, community. Okay. Community care, self-care, walking the talk. I respect that. We got a lot of not doing that. So as we share, our values, and I definitely encourage you while you're in the chat to see if you see any consistent or, patterns. I see a lot of community. I see a lot of being able to have communication, right? So we're gonna table this for a second, but keep it close, because we are going to come back to that. And remember your value rating of this. So the next slide that I accidentally pushed, and I'm not sure about how anyone else works throughout the week, but Saturdays, I think culturally, were always like the cleaning days. So I have the laundry, we had the Fabuloso going, open up the windows, let out that negative energy. And then I was just like, I had to come back an hour before and do this. So if it seems like there's a lot of things happening, it's just, I don't know, Saturday mornings waking up to clean. That was just a thing. So when we talk about guilt versus shame, so as someone who is a writer, I am very big personally on understanding the words that we use, right? So we often use the word shame and guilt interchangeably, but when you look deeper, both of these encompass very different emotions and feelings. So guilt is about what I did versus shame is about who I am. And when you look at the actual definition of guilt, it is understanding your feeling after you committed an offense or a crime. And again, we're using the words offense and crimes, which are, very big words. We might think of like actually breaking the law. But offense and crime might be something as simple like, you made a mistake on something and you feel really guilty about that. But it's being able to understand there was an action made, and now you're like, wow, this is my response to that action. So even an example for myself personally is sometimes I am I want this done in the moment person. So I am that person that will ask you to do something. And if you didn't like fly down the steps to do it, I'm like, I guess we're going to do it ourselves. And I ended up accidentally, messing up our water filter, and I got water everywhere. And I felt a lot of guilt because I didn't say anything to anyone. I just tried to clean it and I didn't clean it well. And then finally I was just like, I got to tell you what happened to my roommate, right? But you see, like there was an incident that actually took place. Like I did something, tried to kind of brush it under the rug, and it just ate at me, because it's like, well, now you're just making the situation worse. And it's like, why are you withholding the truth from someone that you care about, right? Versus shame, which is when you look at the definition, that word painful is very, very important. A painful, humiliating feeling of having disgrace. And having shame is about who I am. So it's taking even that incident that I just talked about of being like, you know what, I lied, I withheld information, and then shame is turning it into, no, you are a liar. Like as a person, you are not honest. As a person, you make too many mistakes. As a person, why do you even think you can live in this safe household when you would do something like that, make a mistake, and then lie about it? And it's humiliating, it's painful, it's a lot, I would say deeper, and a lot more deep rooted, as we will continue on throughout this webinar, because our shame is something that is built and constructed way before, for example, I'm 28. It happened way before I accidentally dropped that water. And I think I see a few people trickling in. I'm seeing the numbers go up. So again, welcome to those. Right now, we're talking about the difference between guilt versus shame. So the root of it all. So at 5 years old, psychologists believe that by the age of 5, the foundations of how you respond to situations is established. So what we mean by responding, if you're somebody who's like, you know what, yep, I dropped this water, or you know what, yep, I didn't tell the truth, or if you feel that you have to lie, if you feel you have to hide, if you are very afraid of being forthcoming because potentially you grew up in a household where you witnessed a lot of violence, abuse, emotional manipulation, so you had to walk on eggshells, that's going to impact you in your adult life. And you're going to feel, even with situations and relationships that are healthier, that you can't come forth with information, right? And by the age of 7, most of our patterns of behavior and beliefs are formed. So at the age of 5, when you learned how to respond to these things, by 7, you learned, okay, people don't like mistakes. I have to be perfect, right? You can't have friends because you can't trust people. So I'm just going to be by myself. So a lot of these things that we're talking about, a lot of these mental blocks that I'm sure a lot of us facing are emotional, trying to get past the sense of shame. I just want to also just lay it out and give everyone the comfort of knowing this didn't just start now. It's actually the book, and I pulled a bunch of books off my shelf. Did I take this one down? No, but it reminds me of the book title. I believe it's like, It Didn't Start With You, right? Like this is not something that started at 17, 28, 35, 54, X, Y, and Z. And when we dive into why it didn't start in that way, we have to also talk about the social constructs that make that happen. So I know, again, we're on a webinar and y'all can only see me, but I'm a very interactive person. And I think because I talk a lot in my personal life, after a while, I'm like, I am talking a lot. So if anybody wants to just throw in the chat what their definition of a social construct is. And this is where we start getting a little into it. But any thoughts, even if you're just going to give a rough definition or what you believe a social construct to be? Interactions between family, friends, and strangers. Yeah, I love that. Social constructs on how we're supposed to interact, what we're supposed to do, and exactly the very people that we interact with at any point of the day, right? They don't exist in reality, but are built by unconscious and conscious interaction between people. Yep, love that one. Definitely getting a little deeper there. Shared ways of thinking about and representing the world. So all of these definitions are correct. And if we want to get into a more concrete definition of that, it's the idea that has been created and accepted by the people in society. So it is a theory in sociology, social ontology, and communication that proposes that there are certain kinds of facts that, rather than depending on reality itself, so I also love in the chat how we use the word reality, because that's very important here, instead of depending on the shared ways of thinking about and representing the world that groups of people develop collaboratively. So understanding that these rules are not written down at all. They're just something we all agreed upon. So an example of a social construct is, for example, when someone is talking, you've just learned that you don't just jump in and interrupt. Even if you're excited, even if you have something to say, that's why even when we do it, we might say, oh, I'm sorry, I just really wanted to give my point. It's understanding that if you are in line, at a drive-through, or if you're at a restaurant that, kind of has a quick pace, you want to try to have in your mind what you're going to order, because you don't want to stand there and hold up the line. I mean, even in a line, it's understanding we don't cut the line. These are social constructs. It's not written down. No one's going to give you a book that has all of this information in that, but it's understanding that, okay, this is how we as a society operate. So this is where I want to pause for a second. I'm actually going to stop sharing here, because now I'm going to go into, as I like to call it, my little rants. But when it comes to social construct, this is also where we have to get into understanding why we have these social constructs, and understanding that a lot of the ways we are operating is not safe for us. And what I mean when I say safe, are there social constructs that, actually do work? For example, you shouldn't cut a line. Absolutely. But are there social constructs that actually are very dangerous to people, dangerous to us? Yes. So those social constructs might look like, as I'm sure we've all heard, and something that I battle with a lot in trying to correct people, is under like this idea that if someone with the reproductive system to have a baby or a child should have that. It is your duty to have a child, right? That is a social construct that is both harmful and incorrect. And when we look at where shame comes from, it looks at also understanding the social constructs that are rooted in institutional oppressions. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen here, but here we have a bunch of phrases, a bunch of ideologies and beliefs that I like to describe as the poison narratives. And here, again, as I was meditating, because although I do similar presentations, I'm very big on whenever I feel that something needs to change, having a change a little bit. So I think it's also just understanding what have we heard, right? So one of the biggest narratives and one of the biggest ideologies that a lot of us have been walking around with and understanding is what happens in this house stays in this house. A social construct that says you cannot talk about what is happening here. And the key thing is to remember, especially when we're looking at a lot of these, maybe not on this presentation, but in life, is this wasn't always supposed to be harmful. So for a lot of folks who are existing as Black and non-Black persons of color, the idea of not talking about what happens in your house is something that was used to make sure that no one could hurt you. But when you've been in a household, whether that is with family, friends, a roommate situation, anything, and you've experienced violence, when you've seen violence, when you've seen hostility, when you've seen emotional and mental trauma and abuse, you can't talk about it. And so what does that mean when you leave that house, right? Whether you go to school, you just move out, or I like to even take it on a little bit more of a spiritual approach is you being the house. So this idea that you can't let people into what's happening within your actual vicinity, you're not even going to let people into what's happening with yourself, right? Boys will be boys. This notion that boys are just allowed and it is okay as a society for them to be misogynistic, for them to be violent, right? Erasing the fact that, number one, as humans, we are all susceptible to trauma and pain, which also means we are all granted the responsibility in our own education as far as being better human beings. But we just allow certain folks to kind of not follow those rules, right? The strong friend, social constructs that you have someone in your group, whether that is you, if you're on this call, whether there's someone that you know, that they are just that pinnacle person that doesn't matter what's happening in their life, they can carry it all. For anyone who doesn't know, I am in love, for example, with the movie Encanto. Luisa and me, I remember when I heard Surface Pressure, I immediately paused and called two of my friends, like, you need to turn on this Encanto because I don't even know what's about to happen. But I heard Surface Pressure and I feel like it's about to get very real, right? So understanding as a strong friend, you can't let anybody in because you always have to have it and carry it all. Others have it worse, kind of tying into the idea that, why are you complaining? And I'm sure for not only myself, but I would hope a lot of people in this world, possibly on this call, for example, when you're witnessing so many acts of violence happening within the world, in other countries, in other people's lives, homes, getting phone calls from people of what's going on, you feel like you can't even have an issue because it's like, well, what am I complaining about? I have access to this, I have access to that. If it's not perfect, keep it. Being able to say, if I can't do it right the first time, the example I gave before, even in my own personal life, something very small, like trying to change this water filter. If I can't do it, I don't want to do it because it should have been right the first time. Too complicated to love. This idea that so many of us feel that we are not only not worthy of being loved, but we have too many complications. We might feel we have so much trauma that who would ever love? Or if you're like me, the thought of put up with that because we're too much, we're too extra. Over-sexualized and submissive. So I brought out, because I always show and talk about a lot of books that I think people should read, but I actually took them off my shelf for this one. So Hood Feminism by Mickey Kendall is actually where I really dived into the point of over-sexualized and submissive, which is where we look at certain groups of women of color. So being able to look at Black and Latina women that often fall into being over-sexualized as a culture. And when you're looking at Indigenous, Native, and women of the Asian diaspora as being very submissive, using people's culture as costumes. And I know it's Halloween weekend, so just a PSA, please don't do that, right? Because that also aids in the violence that happens to people of those cultures. Our Eurocentric standards of beauty, understanding that a lot of us do not fall into what society says is beautiful, right? So we end up falling victim to a lot of our beauty standard culture, a lot of fat phobic narratives, right? And lastly, and again, this list is not comprehensive of all of these narratives, right? It's weaponizing even religious beliefs to tell people that on a spiritual level, that you are not worthy of love, you're not worthy of safety, you're not even worthy of being here because you just, are not holy enough. You're not put in whatever word, that may be in your religious practice or other religious practice that you've seen. And, again, that's why, and I would like to give that point that it's weaponizing of religion, because there is nothing wrong with religious and spiritual practices. But when we start weaponizing it to make people feel shame for their being, that's where we have an issue. So I would like to pause real quick because I know I just said a lot, sped through a lot, talked a lot. And I want us to, if we want to throw into the chat, if there's any one of these narratives that either we've heard or we very much are like, you know what, I felt that. I definitely think I'm maybe battling a little bit of that myself. I definitely will say for myself, the what happens in this house stays in this house narrative. I don't think I just personally think, as someone who grew up in a Black household, that is just like a stamp. That is just something you've always heard, right? And I've had to do a lot of unpacking of the shame of feeling like I can't even open up to people. So if anyone wants to throw in any one of these narratives that they've heard. And then as we do that, while I was going through the presentation this morning, I made some notes, because what's very also important about these narratives, and when we get into a few more slides about, the different forms of shame, what's also important for folks on this call who might be advocates or have resources or they're therapists is also understanding that these narratives and other are the foundational floors, as we said, to shame. And as our situations arise, that's our way of confirmation for them, right? But this is where we have to get a little bit deeper, and why I totally recommend books such as Hood Feminism, as to the institutional oppressions that also upholds a lot of these mindsets. And what I mean by that is, for myself, being an Afro-Latina woman, right, and very much presenting as a Black person, the shame I feel when I go on social media and I hear how many podcasts are very popular shaming Black women. I even the other day, my friend shared one with me, which was basically like, you want to know why Black women die in the hospital all the time? Because you're on reality TV just acting X, Y, and Z, and that's why people don't respect you, right? And I think we have to have a deeper conversation. And, this is a little bit different for people who might have heard this presentation before, but, time has passed and I've had time to sit with this, is unless we're willing to get to the root cause and the root foundational racism, ableism, sexism, xenophobia, all the phobias and everything out there, we cannot truly address not only stopping these things, but also acknowledging and unpacking them within ourselves. And actually, it's a very loose definition from and I feel bad if I get her title wrong, so someone please throw it in the chat. But our advocacy coordinator, Quinn, here at We Are Her, is that when we make a lot of these conversations an individual issue, we're ignoring a larger conversation of the community and generational conversations. And what that looks like is, when you're talking about women of a certain race, for example, being over-sexualized, and we just look at it like, okay, well, I'm just going to work on this one person, but you're not addressing the being, right? Or we're not addressing the community that both is taking on this narrative and the communities that are giving this narrative. We're not doing the work really to stop that. And I think right now we're in a very pivotal point that we need to understand. And I know this is for, we're talking now about shame and survivors, right? And this is what I did even every time I've given this workshop, is understanding that this shame is in every part of your life. So it's understanding shame in your relationship. It's shame being a survivor of assault and abuse. It's shame in your work. It's shame in family. And until we're ready to, I would say, dive deep down into a lot of these constructs, we're missing a big part of the conversation. So that's just a little plug and a thought to a lot of the folks on this call who might be someone who is working in a resource or who is a social worker counselor, is to really think about, working on this on a individual level is one thing, but we need to work on this on a community level. I want us to pull out our values list that we did, right? Looking back at our values, right? We have our values, we have our how we rated it, right? I know we had communication at like 10, we had walking the talk, we had communication, autonomy, adventure. And now understanding our shame, understanding some of the narratives that impacted our shame. Now I want you to write a number, a very honest number of your action rating for that. Because it's one thing to say, I value adventure in my life, but it's another thing to say, adventure really only comes in at a 2. And then from there, I want us to write down what narratives we think are impacting why the values that we have in our life are not being upheld. So take some time, really sit with it. I pulled back up the value list, even if it's maybe as you went through this presentation, you said, I think I have different values. We're going to put our action rating, so it's still a 1 through 10, but I want us to give ourselves an honest number. And then I want us to think about the narratives that are not allowing us to fully live out our values. So as we're coming back now, understanding our values, our value rating, the action of our values, and why, we are feeling the shame, and why, we are not actually living out the values that are so dear to us, right? And I actually see someone threw in there that a big component of them is trust, right? So if anyone feels like they want to share within community, feel free to do so. If not, totally understandable. I'm going to come back to where we were and briefly talk about the inner critic when it comes to shame. So when we talk about the inner critic, and this is where I want to have us understand that even we wrote down, for example, our action and why and what social constructs might be limiting us, right? Is also understanding that the inner critic inside of you that says things like, you know what, this is never going to work out. Or, you know what, you're not good enough for this. It's also having a reframing of that inner critic to understand that these are narratives, just like the narratives actually we saw before, that are no longer serving you. Because when you look up, or do research or read, for example, anything about the inner critic, it likes to make itself sound like the voice of reason. And a lot of times it's trying to protect you. So the thing I like to tell people about the mind is always going to be like, no, the last time we did this thing, the last time we spoke out and gave a boundary, it didn't really work out too well for us. So let's just not do that. And we have to almost train and have our mind relearn that, number one, you are all the captain of the ship. And number two, most importantly, that thank you so much for trying to do this to protect me, but we now understand the real ways that we need to be protected. And that inner critic will shame us in its own way to have us in a way stay isolated, to be protected, to not feel uncomfortable. And I think that's one thing, if no one has said that before, no one has articulated that, is we within our bodies don't want to feel uncomfortable. So we will do everything and anything in our power not to do so. And if that means discouraging, if that means telling you, you know what, you do not look good in that outfit, no one's going to like you. You know what, if your family didn't appreciate you, who else will? It's understanding that it's a way of self-preservation. But being able to say, you know what, thank you so much for trying to do this, but I release these narratives, I release this inner critic, and I want to be able to jump in my own voice. So I just wanted to touch on that because a lot of us might not know fully where that voice even comes from. And it's really your own conscious, in a sense, trying to be able to say, like, I'm trying to help you. Why are you trying to do these things? And, when we talk about shame and connection to that, it's understanding that shame talks through our inner critic, right? And when we go through these four components of shame, and again, these are more, but when I was doing even my own research of putting this presentation together, these, as I said before, are kind of the confirmation that make us feel the shame. So if we grew up again in a household, like someone said before, or having many experiences, right, of not feeling trust, these experiences are what kind of give you that confirmation of, what, you can't trust. So when we talk about unrequited love, it's the love that we feel is not even love that we feel. It's love that is not being reciprocated, love that is not being given back to us. And that could be from a parent, that could be from family, that could be from friends, that could be just, and I think even understanding how our media, especially social media, plays into this. This could even be the assumed love that we see other people getting that we don't feel like we're getting, right? Unwanted exposure. So being able to feel that we are drawing attention to ourselves that we don't want, right? And again, when we look at things like narratives that involve kind of being perfect. So if you're not good at it, if it's not perfect, let it go. Happens in this house, stays in this house. Feeling like you need a Eurocentric or other standards of beauty and you don't have that, and now you're getting that exposure, that brings a lot of shame. Everyone's looking at me, I'm not doing this correctly. Disappointment or disappointed expectation. We all have our expectations, right? And when we create these goals, when we create these values and we feel like we're not living up to them the way that we expected, we might find a lot of shame from that. And the last one is also exclusion, being left out, very, very simply just being left out of things. And one thing I would like to add with all four of these components is going back to also what this looks like on a grand level. Understanding that exclusion not only impacts us on an individual level, but it impacts us on a societal level. I'm sure many of us on this call have felt potentially with ways we identify, right? For example, myself feeling the exclusion of even the way laws are being made, that they don't exclude people, that they exclude people that look like me. The unwanted exposure of the way people might be framing my community, the disappointed expectation of thinking, you know what, I thought we got to a place in our world where truly I did, that in 2023, we can all just have an appreciation of different folks, different people, but we're not. So understanding that shame is not just an individual concept, but even on this grand level, what ways have we might even experience shame on this level? How can we learn to recognize shame, and what does shame feel like in the body? So I want us to take a moment, write that down, and I know we're coming up on a few minutes. So this is something that definitely feel free to work on your own as well. But understanding, and I have a few notes here, shame can feel like anxiety. It can lead to depression. It feels like a tightness in your chest. It can feel like being hypervigilance. It feels like I actually have here, and just, doing even this presentation before, just very loud in the mind, right? And being able to recognize shame and being able to recognize how it impacts us in our body is also a big indicator and a big compass on how we can silence that. So for example, if you are trying to silence the inner critic, and like I said, think of it almost like a person that's trying to help you. It's kind of like that annoying friend that has a list of all the things that you like got wrong or all the things that you've been through. And it's like, well, remember that other time that we did this? It's saying, thank you so much for that record, but I'm fine. I'm great. I'm going to do this over here. And having even the practices to be able to quiet your mind, quiet yourself. That could look like giving a verbal like stop. That could look like listening to your music. That could look like putting yourself in a room where you have positive sensory experiences. Another technique I heard and I actually really like, because it's very helpful for me as someone who loves film and media, is actually even being able to rewatch certain shows and certain movies because you actually know the ending and you know the way it's going to go. And that can also help you kind of quiet that mind and to really dig into the shame that you're feeling in your body. And yep, I'm sorry, I just opened up the chat, but I see shame also feels like embarrassment, right? And if anyone else wants to throw any words, please feel free, because I do think that's important. Embarrassment is a huge, huge component, and practices to implement, kind of like what I was going through before, our 5 grounding techniques. And I apologize, but I'm also making sure to keep the time. So that looks like being able to start with, and you can do this in any order, but 5 things that you see, 4 things that you hear, 3 things that you can touch, 2 things that you would like to taste, and then it's supposed to be like 1 thing you can smell. I have taste twice, and I apologize for that. And again, these things can be remixed, they can be remodeled to fit anyone. Being able to verbally interrupt yourself, like I said, being able to give the verbal, like, stop, we're not thinking that way, we're going to pull ourselves back. Being able to listen to upbeat music, movies, shows on repeat, journaling, a very important component to this. And if accessible, being able to have therapy. I understand therapy is not accessible to a lot of people, unfortunately, but if you have the access to have that, I would definitely recommend. And again, it does not have to be talk therapy. There are many different forms. And right now, which I think is very important, a lot of therapists actually offer consultations. So taking that up if you need. Monthly me time, learning about who you are. We talked a lot, in the beginning about we value communication, we're valuing community. But if you don't really value it or have that value set to where you're living in community, to where you're living in positive communication, you might not know what that looks like even with yourself. So taking yourself and spending time with yourself, monthly me time. Listen, I tell people, you will hear me talking to myself because it is a staff meeting and I make myself laugh. On my Myers-Briggs, I am a protagonist. So I am the main character in my own life, right? But I've learned that with my me time. I've learned that I can be by myself. My house, I can share and tell people what's wrong. And lastly on this list, and again, these are not the only things, is affirmations. I have some even for myself in my room and in my bathroom hanging up, being able to uplift yourself, being able to call out. And for homework after this, all those values that you wrote down, making affirmations that also go with them. Don't just write this down and do this one workshop and then that's it. No, I want us to really make sure that these values that we pointed out, we're going to continue. So this is a poem by Shel Silverstein that I personally never forgot. Again, I'm a poet and I really like it. So she had blue skin and so did he. He kept it hid and so did she. They searched for blue their whole life through, then passed right by and never knew. And when we talk about shame and why I felt the need to throw this poem in there, is so much of shame is us and subconsciously covering up who we really are. So a lot of us are walking into this world, I've heard, at like a level 2 of ourselves because we think it's safer, we think it's more palatable, we think, people will like it. But what happens is truly what we're looking for is deeper, more intimate connections. And I know there are people probably on this call in many different versions of their life and what an intimate connection looks like. But unfortunately, we won't find that until we admit to ourselves who we are. So if you're valuing, I'm thinking of the word someone who put in their adventure, it's being able to unpack and really move through the shame, move through those narratives we were talking about, because you can find other people that those are their values as well. But if we're going through life not acknowledging who we truly are, then we're never really going to find the people who are able to identify in the ways we are. The joke I like to give people is, I'm not really the friend you can call and hang out with till 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. No, but I am the friend where if Stevie knows if you need a presentation, you need someone to pick up to the airport, you need someone to call you, find you a lawyer, because I'm doing that for someone, to help you with court. I am that friend and I will go out, just not till 3 a.m. I'm auntie age. I need a chair. I need to know there's a meal and I need a parking spot. But because I understand who I am and because I let go of the shame of, for example, fun, because fun was one of my values, I'm able to also have fun, but also acknowledge that, you know what, I like deeper connections, and I'm okay with being like, no, I don't go out here. That's just not, it's not my vibe. And finding the people that also uplift me in that. But that took a lot of work, and that took a lot of time. I know we have 2 minutes left. And I think the last thing I will say, in regards to shame and what it might look like to use this presentation or to use the different things that you learned, I would actually, because it's very helpful, the values that you wrote down, write them down, hang them up. And as you go through one, understanding the shame, to unpack them, I want you to go back to this idea of affirmations, this idea of letting go, right? Letting go of the narratives that no longer serve us, and create affirmations that align with your values. So off the top of my head, I'm trying to think, because I don't have this in front of me, but I know like one of mine, for example, was fun. Because I valued fun a lot. I always wanted to have fun. I felt like I couldn't, right? And for me, and just understanding where we are as an organization, for me personally, it was being a survivor of sexual assault. I felt like having fun would put me back in a situation where I would be assaulted and harmed. So I was like, you can't have fun. And even in my household, it was like, friends are bad for you. People will hurt you, right? And then again, for me, being assaulted was kind of that confirmation, like, yeah, I can't do this. So my affirmation for fun, if I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, was just simply, I value being able to form genuine connections and smile and find joy. So I uphold fun in my life, and just being able to say that and being able to really have that on my mind. And thank you for, again, taking time out of your morning, your afternoon to join us for this workshop. If you have not already, please be sure to make sure you're following We Are Her. Keep up to date with any of our events. I think we have a few other things pending. And again, I'm just very thankful for this organization for giving me the opportunity to give this talk. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your morning and or afternoon.